Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you so much for joining me on this webinar number 2, Overview of Unwrapping the Standards. My name is Dave Nagel. Really excited, as always, to share thoughts and ideas with my colleagues in Valley View School District. For those of you that are coming into the cohorts 4 or the special education teachers coming into one of your 2 cohorts, it's a great opportunity to get an overview of unwrapping the standards and hopefully have a chance to practice unwrapping 1 or 2 and to bring that to the session when you come, when we start our workshop or seminar here in the next month or so. It's a chance more than anything to do an overview and give people some background, but also if you have a chance to practice ahead of time, it's just going to provide us more of an opportunity to build upon that work and provide more time for you during those days to work on your own individual assessments. For those of you that might be watching who have been through the cohorts already, it's a good chance to review and to go a little bit deeper with your understanding of unwrapping the standards and why that's such an important process in any assessment design, but also in what we should do on an ongoing basis in our instructional planning. One of the points I want to make each and every time we come together is that any assessment always comes down to these 3 points. We determine what our purpose is, and then we try to make an inference from evidence. The more we can gather quality evidence to make the more quality inferences, we can make better instructional adjustments. So it's really important that we target our purpose so we gather the right evidence. And far too often, we do gather evidence from students that might not align with what we're really looking for or is aligned within that standard that we're focusing on and targeting. So as we look at the 10-step design process, we're going to be looking at step 2. We'll talk, for those of you that haven't been with me, what we mean by a priority or a supporting standard. But a priority standard is the focus of that unit of instruction or that piece that I'm working on right now. And certain standards might at times be priorities for some units, supportings for others. That's not as important right now for us to remember. What's important is how we look to unwrap it to identify the accurate and targeted rigor levels that we need to be teaching towards, but also assessing so we know how to make the right kinds of instructional adjustments. As always, I hope we can have an interactive activity that could take place, and certainly this is a recorded webinar, so it's hard to be interactive in the moment, but if you have a question or a thought, please do not hesitate to come straight to me. You don't have to go through anyone else. You see my phone number. A lot of people would rather probably use email. I'll provide my other email address at the end of the webinar, as well as if you are a Twitter person or a follower, you can follow me there as well on Twitter. We definitely will focus on clarity throughout all of the work we try to do, so our learning intention will be to understand the importance of identifying learning targets and accurate rigor levels from the academic standards that we're teaching and focusing on. That's what my charge is. You as the learners will know you've met the learning targets when you can complete these 3 success criteria. Be able to understand why unwrapping standards is a critical step in the quality assessment design process. Be able to determine how to deconstruct a standard by identifying the concepts and the skills that are written and embedded within the standard, and then determine accurate rigor levels that students must demonstrate to meet the standard you are teaching. So again, you see these on your working handout, which hopefully everyone has in front of them. And throughout most of the webinars I'll provide, there'll be some type of handout just like this, and a chance for you to jot some reflection notes down, maybe complete an activity. And certainly if you're watching in a group, I think it's a great opportunity to have some good reflective dialogue and practice together. There'll be several times when I will say, pause the recording here and complete the reflection, whatever that is. I will leave that up to you to determine how much time you do pause and jot down your ideas. I'm going to try and keep the webinar length as short as possible. So again, I'll say pause the recording here. I'll come back quickly, but I'm going to assume that you took as much time as needed to complete whatever the reflection or activity was. So our first reflection question today is, what is your definition of cognitive rigor? We use that term a lot, but I want to kind of ask you and challenge you, what is your definition when we say cognitive rigor? Please take a moment and complete the reflection question number 1. If you're with a group, even better, pause the recording as long as needed. Welcome back. Again, hopefully you had a chance to pause the recording, complete reflection question 1. If you haven't done so, please do so now. So whenever we've done this activity in the large group, and we'll do so in the next few cohorts, we get a myriad of answers, from difficulty to challenge to how much thinking is involved. First thing we want to do is acknowledge what is not true about rigor. What are some myths about rigor? First one is it's not about more. It's not about more work or about homework. Sometimes there's a myth, and parents erroneously believe that if their students are getting a lot of homework, it must be difficult. It must be a challenging school and a good environment. Well, not necessarily. That some students can't handle rigorous work. Or another big myth that Williamson and Blackburn identified, and I think we could all see this as common sense, is that if we have to support the learner or support the student along the way, that it loses its level of rigor. If we think about hitting a pitch baseball, there's a certain degree of rigor involved. And we would never bat an eye if an athlete at any level needed to back up and practice and use the tee to get the swing down or do a soft toss before we go back to the actual pitching the ball. Sometimes it's just what needs to happen for any learner. So we need to realize just because we're supporting them along the way so they can eventually get to the standard on their own doesn't mean that the rigor level has been lost. We're going to use Webb's depth of knowledge, or DOK. This is where we're going to look at the complexity of knowledge reflected in the content standards and then the assessment items that we'll provide that are aligned to the standards. And it's important to realize how deeply the student needs to understand the content for a response to be given. So this is where the content is going to be augmented by what the skill tells us, differently though than Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom specifically was a taxonomy. The skill difficulty was determined by the verb and it built from lowest to highest. Webb's depth of knowledge is not a taxonomy. It doesn't necessarily build. Difficulty is determined by the demand and the context and how the verb is applied. So that's why when we unwrap the standards, we're going to look at not just the skills or the verbs, but what the students actually have to do with them. That's why that is so important, as you'll see the unwrapping examples both in your handout and what I'll guide through here on the screen shortly. And again, this is about the assessment question and the complexity that will determine the cognitive demand, not the student work, not the work that they have to produce. So even though they might have to produce more, doesn't necessarily mean that it's more rigorous. What does DOK look like in the classroom? For those of you who are familiar with this, it's a review, but at least it's a chance for all of us to kind of, if it's new, to refresh. And I'm sorry if it's a review to refresh, but if it's new, even more important that we come into the certification with kind of an understanding. DOK 1, there's one right answer. And some of you might have seen the video from Engage New York. We might have been watching that when we're together, where they examine the Gettysburg Address and they look at 7 years ago as a question. What did that mean? There's really only one right answer, and it's a simple math problem. 4 times 20 plus 7. So even though there's multiple steps, there's only one right answer. It's a DOK 1. Depth of knowledge 2 is when there's more than one right answer, but it requires justification. So why was 7 years ago so important when Lincoln used that? It's because 87 years before he'd given the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence was written when all men were created equal. There was a justification why that number was significant. Now, there's a precipice between depth of knowledge 2 and 3 when we move from one right answer to more than one correct answer. And that's why when we look at the type of DOK that's reflected in the assessment, or excuse me, in the standard, that will determine the type of assessment items we will use and we will write. Very few standards are actually written at a depth of knowledge 4. Often this requires multiple sources. But rarely do we teach standards in isolation, so we can eventually get to a 4. I want to be clear that that's not necessarily the end-all, be-all goal each and every time. It's not that 4 is better than 3 or so on and so forth. It's making sure that we're aligning our assessments and our items to the accurate level of DOK that is written and expected within the standards as they are written. I'm going to show you one simple example where we look at the same verb used at all 3 levels and why Bloom's taxonomy cannot be the guide that it used to be. Science example, where if we're looking at what are the 3 main parts of a cell, a eukaryotic cell, we have the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. There's really only one right answer. It's those 3 responses. The differences between plant cells and animal cells, there's a limited number of answers, and there's a justification that's required. Plant cells and usually have more water, so they have a larger vacuole. They also have a cell wall versus just a cell membrane. So we're still at a level 2, but there was only one right answer necessarily, or specific answers, but there was some justification. There's a precipice between DOK 2 and 3 when we describe a model that we would use to represent the inner workings of a cell. There's definitely more than one right answer there. So we can see how the same verb can be used in tasks that we provide students, but that verb described doesn't necessarily drive the level of difficulty, complexity, or more importantly, the level of rigor. So another chance to pause the recording. What are your personal reflections related to the 4 levels of depth of knowledge, and how would you describe the applicability of these to your classroom in terms of the standards you are teaching and assessing, and the rigor level that needs to be brought in? Please pause the recording for several minutes, complete the reflection, and hopefully if you're in groups, you can do so as a group. Welcome back. Again, hopefully you've had a chance to complete the reflection question. If you haven't, pause the recording, don't move on. Please jot some ideas down. And again, these are ideas that I'm hoping you can bring to the sessions, and we can augment the work by clearing up any misconceptions, but also allowing teachers that are very busy to come in with a better understanding and accelerate the time we have to complete work and walk out with a more finished product. So going back to the 10-step process, looking at step 2, unwrapping priority standards to create a graphic organizer. Sometimes it's been called uncovering or deconstructing. Larry's chosen the term unwrapping. That's the term we're going to use. We're going to find the critical elements within a standard or define our purpose before we gather evidence to make an accurate inference. So here we're going to start with a language arts example. You see the same thing on your handout. Reading for informational text for an 11th and 12th grade level. Determine the central idea of a text, the central idea or information of a primary or secondary source. Provide an accurate summary of how key events or ideas develop over the course of a text. First thing we're going to do is circle or identify the skills. What are the skills or the things that students have to be able to do within the standard? Now, one point with this particular standard, we see provide an accurate summary. Well, by default, then, students are going to have to summarize. So we actually have a concept and a skill at the same time within this particular standard. That happens when we see predict or prediction. But the first thing, to keep it simple, we want to just identify the skills and then come back later and look at some of the other concepts. So what I'm doing here is I'm underlining the concepts. Now we see here on the left-hand side, you see in your graphic organizer, all we've done is pulled out the concepts or the nouns or noun phrases. And in parentheses, I've put at times the adjective. There's more than just an idea. It's actually the central idea that matters. What I've done here is identified just the nouns, just the concept, what students need to know within that standard. Certainly, it's not the first time at a junior or senior level that they've seen or heard the word text. This is not for them yet. This is for us to know what are the things within the standard that are concepts that I need to get down. And then, what are the skills? What are the students going to have to do with the concepts? If you remember back, depth of knowledge is the degree of understanding of the concepts that students have to demonstrate through the verbs. So if you look here, what I've done is I've identified that if you look at your handout as well, students have to determine a central idea. They also have to determine information from a primary source or information from a secondary source. They have to provide an accurate summary. But then they also will have to summarize. Again, summarize is not written within this standard, which is why we have to do more than just underline and circle. That gets us in the ballpark, but then we have to look at it at the whole standard in its context, the whole construct. They have to summarize key events over the text and summarize key ideas over the text. So we can't just list determine, provide, summarize. What do they have to determine? They actually have to determine multiple things, provide an accurate summary, and they have to summarize the key events as well as the key ideas. Then what we will do is we will use the Hess cognitive rigor matrix to figure out what might the DOK level be. And so we do start on the left-hand side with looking at the Bloom's taxonomy verbs just to get us in the ballpark. But then we move across to say what might they actually have to do with that particular element within the standard, and you have the rigor matrix matrices within your handout as well. And so here we can see, for the most part, the first one, more than one right, or there's only one right answer. Determine the central idea from a primary or secondary source, providing an accurate summary. Now I listed 2, 3, and that was intentional for a teaching point. So when we come back together, we'll have a discussion around it. It's kind of right on that precipice, and that's where we have to look at that context, and as teachers decide, is it really written at a 2 or a 3? It's possible those key events we would summarize at a 2, but the key ideas might be more than one right answer there. So again, this is where we don't want to just list as 2, 3 every time, or 1, 2 because we're quote unquote not sure. But I wanted to say sometimes we have to look at the context and decide together where are we at. And if we err on the side of caution, We can always go up, because if students meet it at above the level of a standard that is written, well, it's better than if we undershot it. But sometimes we're right at that level where it's right at that 2-3, which will drive how we write assessment items almost at both levels on our common formative assessment that we will create and develop. What we've done now is we've created a roadmap. When I create my common formative assessment, the unwrapping will be what I use to write all of my items, to make sure that I gather enough evidence to make an inference. Can they determine the central idea of a primary and secondary source? Can they provide an accurate summary? Can they summarize the key details over the text? This has to be my roadmap. So what we don't do is unwrap and then just move on and write our assessment items. This becomes the vehicle or the driver for everything else we do in writing our assessment. And again, you see the specific example on your working handout. Going to move on to a math example now. Same process. We're going to circle the verbs, circle the skills that the students have to demonstrate, and then identify the concepts. What are the nouns or the noun phrases? And again, this is sort of just a simple activity of underlining and circling. It's how Larry has always introduced it. It's how he taught me when I was a classroom teacher and he came to my district. Before I ever started working with him and working with his work, I was in a classroom just like a lot of you. Larry happened to come to my school back in 1998. We became one of the partner districts at the time with the Leadership and Learning Center. And so I've been fortunate to work with Unwrapping and assessment design for a long time. Underlining and circling is the way he always taught it. It's the way I always do it. It's more important when we get into this graphic organizer. Again, on the left-hand side, all the concepts, the nouns or the noun phrases. Then on the right side, then we add the skills, the verbs with what they have to do. So we can't, again, just list read or write, because they have to do multiple things. They have to read multi-digit whole numbers using base 10 numerals. They have to read number names. They have to read expanded form. So it's important that we're aligning the concepts with the skill, because that then identifies the DOK level. And then below you see comparing and using and recording. Comparing what though? Comparing two multi-digit numbers. Using greater than, equals, or less than symbols. Recording the results of the comparisons. So it's critical when we unwrap that we don't just underline and circle and then just list those 5 particular skills, but what we actually have to do with them in terms of adding the concepts next to them. So they're not aligned in terms of this organizer where what's on the left automatically meets the right. First, we just list the concepts on the left. That's why there's a little bit like a bar there. That just tells me on the left-hand side, what is the vocabulary possibly the kids need to be aware of and have a solid understanding of. Not that even at the 4th grade level, it's the first time they've ever seen digit, or the first time they've seen perhaps greater than or equal to. It might be. But then more importantly after that, what do they have to do with the skills? And then using the rigor matrix, how do we line up DOK or depth of knowledge? And again, you see this in your handout, and we've also included the Hess rigor matrix. Finally, we've included a next generation science example. Construct and present arguments using evidence to support the claim that gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on the mass of interacting objects. One more time, we're circling the verbs or the skills, and then underlining the nouns or the noun phrases and the concepts. And then again, see here on the left-hand side, the concepts or the nouns or noun phrases. Now I put an asterisk there for a specific point. When we look at this particular standard, what we can't do when we unwrap, and science teachers will really understand this, is standards are like matter. They can't be created or destroyed. But when we see gravitational interactions that are attractive, one of the concepts would be attractions, but I've listed them with an asterisk, and I would put a footnote below, so if someone saw my unwrapping, they would understand why I came up with that. Now we see the skills. They have to construct an argument to support the claim. They have to present the argument to support the claim. They have to use evidence to support the claim that gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on the masses of interacting objects. What I want to make sure people don't think is just we're recreating or rewriting the standard. What we've done here in this left-hand column is that's the vocabulary or the terms that the students are going to have to know throughout this unit to understand and be able to represent the skills in the way that they will have to. But then, what do they have to do with that content? They have to construct the argument, present the argument. Those are 2 different things. And while certainly we could teach them at the same time, even assess them somewhat at the same time, we have to make sure we can make a determination. Because as a former science teacher myself, I guarantee we have students that can construct the argument, but they can't present it. or they could present an argument, but the argument's kind of weak. So this helps us be able to determine maybe what parts of the standard are they're achieving and reaching, and what are they missing, but also, as we'll talk about later in the process, bringing students into it so they can begin to monitor their own learning. And again, all three of these pretty much fall into that depth of knowledge at a 3 level. So, chance before you do our practice activity to reflect. What is your reflections on the overview of unwrapping standards or unwrapping a standard? Please take a moment, pause the recording, and if you're with a group, this is a great time to have some interaction and dialogue around looking at the standard as they're written, but then as you see again here, breaking them down to what really is called for in terms of the knowledge that's needed and then the level of understanding students have to demonstrate. Welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to pause the recording, have a little bit of reflection and dialogue, and with your peers, if you're in a small group, even better. So now we're going to have a chance to practice unwrapping a standard. So what I would like you to do is select a current and relevant standard from your team or grade level to practice unwrapping. If you're coming to the cohort here in a few weeks, maybe it's one that you're going to choose to unwrap. And for those teachers that are coming, if you're coming in October, pretty much anyone the rest of this fall, it shouldn't be an assessment that you're going to use until after you complete all 4 days. So really it should be something second semester, third quarter, or fourth quarter. But take time and in your working handout, write out the full verbiage of the standard. What does the standard say? Verbatim. And then list the nouns or noun phrases. What are the verbs or the skills? And then you have the Hess rigor matrix to try and identify what would the DOK level be for that particular verb and skill combination with that noun or noun phrase, just like we've done so far. And again, I'm hoping this is a chance for you to bring a completed example to the session to accelerate the work, but please feel free to email me your completed examples, and I'll be happy to provide any feedback if necessary. I'm assuming now you're going to pause the recording and complete that, so I'm just going to complete the rest of the webinar. The acid test, as always, would 2 or more teachers or educators come up with the same level of context, rigor, agreement of skills, concepts when unwrapping the same standard. That's why it's important that if we're in a group, we unwrap it individually first, and then we look at each other and look with our examples with each other and see if we were accurate. And if we have that, is it between the 2 or 3? That's a great place to have that dialogue to see if we're on the same proverbial page. But what we want to make sure doesn't happen is in one classroom, we're looking at a standard, unwrapping it at a much lower rigor level than our peers across the hall, because not only does that provide inaccurate information for the students in terms of we assess them, it really sets us up, as we all know, we've had students that have walked into our classrooms, might not be on grade level, but perhaps their report card would definitely convey that they are, or their parents have a nice bumper sticker on their minivan. This is where we've got to be more intentional with the accuracy of the assessments and tools we're using to provide students accurate feedback on their learning and make our own quality instructional adjustments. Really appreciate the time and effort, not only on this webinar, but through the process. This is a great opportunity in Valley View to take some of the visible learning work that we've been talking about and looking at and really put some concrete technical pieces to it. So again, if there's one takeaway out of all the process that comes out of Larry's work, it's that if we unwrap with quality, we're going to identify more accurate rigor levels in terms of the standards, assess them effectively, and make more stronger instructional inferences to make adjustments. If you have any thoughts or questions, please email me. This is my other email address, davenagelvlplus@gmail.com. Please feel free to visit corwin.com for more information on CFA and visible learning, and then my website, gradingforimpact.com. Thanks, and have an awesome day.